Typhoon Opong, also known locally as Ong, has unleashed its full fury on the Philippines, leaving a scene of devastation in the central region of the archipelago. Masbate province has become the epicenter of this catastrophe, receiving the direct impact of two successive storms that transformed the lives of thousands of families in a matter of hours. The most exposed communities have been caught unaware by the force of a system that, with sustained winds of up to 110 kilometers per hour, has collapsed infrastructure, disrupted basic services, and forced thousands of people to flee their homes to seek refuge in temporary shelters. Opong's first blow came early Friday morning, when a storm made landfall in Masbate with an intensity that exceeded many expectations. Residents of the capital city witnessed how the gusts ripped through roofs, toppled trees, and left debris strewn along streets that became impassable. At a local church where several families had taken shelter, the wind ripped out doors, windows, and even the roof, leaving dozens of people praying for survival exposed. Among them, several children suffered injuries that required immediate medical attention, a scene that reflected the harshness of the night. There was no respite. Hours later, a second earthquake struck the same province, deepening the destruction and leaving even more people homeless. The magnitude of the disaster led local authorities to launch desperate calls for help, as the power grid collapsed and much of the region was left in darkness. Main roads were blocked by fallen trees and twisted power poles, while the most vulnerable neighborhoods were isolated under the threat of further landslides and flash floods. The scene the next morning was bleak. Emergency teams worked tirelessly to rescue people trapped in the rubble, clear roads, and open passageways to evacuation centers. The number of displaced families numbered in the hundreds, with mothers, the elderly, and children sleeping on the cold floor of makeshift shelters. The loss of homes was widespread, with walls reduced to ruins and roofs ripped off by the wind, forcing a prolonged and costly recovery for a population already battered by previous cyclones. Opong wasn't limited to Masbate. Before its arrival, it had already struck eastern Samar province on Thursday night, marking its first landfall as a typhoon. The clock was ticking around 11:30 p.m. when the full force of the system swept across the eastern coast, an event that surprised many families despite prior warnings. It was the first time in many years that a cyclone of this magnitude had hit Samar Island in September, exposing the vulnerability of fishing communities that depend on the sea for their livelihoods. In eastern Samar, dawn brought dramatic scenes. Uprooted trees, power lines lying on the ground, and wooden homes reduced to rubble. Agricultural losses are expected to be enormous, as wind and rain battered rice and cornfields, crops vital to the local economy. Farmers watched helplessly as their crops recovered, aware that it could take months to recover their crops, impacting the region's food supply and economic stability. One of the most tragic episodes linked to the typhoon's passage was the disappearance of 5 fishermen from eastern Samar, who ventured out to sea the previous Tuesday and failed to return. Search operations have been hampered by bad weather, while their families await news amid anxiety and uncertainty. The Coast Guard has deployed to multiple ports where thousands of passengers and vessels remain stranded due to the complete suspension of maritime transport. Another example of the nationwide reach of this phenomenon. The human impact has spread to at least 11 regions of the country, where more than 1.2 million people have been directly or indirectly affected by Opong. More than 400,000 have been evacuated to emergency shelters, where response capacity is beginning to be insufficient given the magnitude of the tragedy. In total, it is estimated that more than 60,000 people were affected in eastern Visayas, with several municipalities under maximum alert due to the risks of winds, storm surges, and torrential rains. The effects of the typhoon were also felt in the capital, Manila. Strong winds forced the suspension of judicial activities, and fears of flooding kept millions of residents on alert. The central government, aware of the seriousness of the situation, ordered the mobilization of all available agencies to address the emergency, prepositioning food, water, and basic necessities in the most strategic locations. The destruction of infrastructure amounts to hundreds of millions of pesos. Roads, bridges, and power systems have been severely damaged, hampering not only the delivery of humanitarian aid, but also the continuity of daily life in the hardest-hit provinces. Preliminary reports indicate significant losses in the fishing and agricultural sectors, jeopardizing not only immediate food supplies, but also the economic security of thousands of families in the coming months. As the system moved towards southern Luzon and Romblon province, the damage continued to spread. At every point in its path, the typhoon left behind power outages, flooding in low-lying areas, and landslides in mountainous areas. The constant rains increased the risk of flash flooding, which in some municipalities had already turned streets into veritable rivers of muddy water. The most critical situation was in Masbate, where the first deaths associated with Opong were confirmed. For people lost their lives in incidents directly related to the typhoon. One victim crushed by a falling tree, another trapped by a collapsing wall, a third struck by debris, and a fourth struck by lightning during a storm. These tragedies have marked the painful human toll of a phenomenon that has devastated the entire region. Chaos on the roads has hampered the arrival of aid, as most roads were blocked by debris. The provincial governor issued an urgent call to accelerate cleanup operations and allow basic supplies to arrive from other provinces. Land access is essential, as maritime transport remains paralyzed and the most remote communities remain isolated. Damage to agriculture is another alarming factor. Rice and corn fields, which are due to be harvested in a few weeks, have been devastated, and there are fears that food security in the affected provinces will be compromised in the coming months. The same is true for fishing, a key sector of the local economy, which has been paralyzed by the destruction of boats and the inability to safely go out to sea. The passage of Typhoon Opong comes at a particularly difficult time for the Philippines, which was still recovering from the devastation of Super Typhoon Regasa and Tropical Storm Mitch, both of which occurred in the same month of September.